Dad told me I wasn't his real daughter to against me in a $20 million inheritance war, but Grandma's secret letter changed everything. My name doesn't matter, but what happened to me might resonate with some of you dealing with toxic family dynamics and inheritance drama. I'm a 32-year-old architectural photographer living in Boston. 3 weeks ago, my grandmother passed away at 84. We were incredibly close. She basically raised me while my parents built their tech company in Silicon Valley. Growing up in our historic Beacon Hill townhouse, one of several properties my grandmother owned, I spent countless hours listening to her stories about our family's journey from Irish immigrants to tech industry pioneers. Unlike my father, Richard, who was always cold and disapproving of my career choice, Grandma Marion supported my passion for photography and architectural preservation. The bombshell dropped at her wake. I overheard my father talking to his longtime friend and our family attorney, Spencer, in Grandma's study. Once the DNA results come back confirming she's not actually my daughter, she won't get a dime of Marion's estate, my father said, his voice colder than I'd ever heard it. The trust is crystal clear. Only blood descendants of the Sullivan family line are eligible. Olivia can go back to taking pictures of buildings and stay out of family business. I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to process what I'd just heard. My father looked up, his face showing no remorse when he realized I'd overheard everything. You weren't supposed to find out this way, he said flatly. But it's true. You're not my biological child. Your mother had an indiscretion with my brother, Liam. I've known for years, but kept it quiet for appearances. Now that Marion is gone, there's no reason to continue the charade. The room spun around me. My Uncle Liam? The free-spirited marine biologist who'd moved to Norway when I was little? The one who sent me birthday cards with stunning photos of fjords and whales that first inspired my love of photography? You're lying, I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. Am I? Ask your mother, he replied with a smirk. She'll confirm everything. But remember this, only blood Sullivans deserve the family fortune. That's been the rule since my grandfather established the trust. I felt sick, betrayed, and completely lost. My entire identity was crumbling around me. The father I desperately tried to please for 32 years was telling me he wasn't my father at all and was using this revelation to cut me out of my grandmother's will. I drove straight to my mother's condo in Cambridge, tears blurring my vision. She opened the door, took one look at my face, and knew immediately. He told you, she said quietly. God, I knew this would happen as soon as Marion died. He's been waiting for this moment for years. Over the next 2 hours, my mother revealed a truth that changed everything. She and Uncle Liam had been college sweethearts before she met my father. When Liam received a prestigious research grant to study marine ecosystems in Norway, they agreed to take a break. During that separation, she met Richard, who was charming, ambitious, and persistent. I was vulnerable and lonely, she explained, her hands trembling as she clutched her tea. Richard swept me off my feet. But when Liam returned unexpectedly for Christmas, we reconnected for one night. By the time I discovered I was pregnant, Richard had already proposed, and Liam had returned to Norway with plans to stay there long term. My father, eager to secure his position in the family's tech empire, insisted the baby was his and rushed the wedding. My mother, young and confused, went along with it, believing it would provide stability for her child. I was 99% certain you were Liam's, but DNA testing wasn't what it is today, and Richard was so insistent, she continued. As the years passed, it became harder to tell the truth. When you were born with green eyes like Liam's instead of brown like Richard's, he knew immediately. That's why he's always been so cold toward you. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. All those years of feeling like I wasn't good enough, of never measuring up to my father's expectations, it all made a terrible kind of sense now. Does Uncle Liam know? I asked. No, my mother said sadly. Richard threatened to contest custody and use his family's resources to destroy Liam's career if I ever told him. Your uncle was just starting out then, with massive student loans and no stability. I couldn't do that to him. I pulled out my phone and searched for recent photos of Uncle Liam. Looking at his face, the same green eyes, the same slight dimple in the left cheek that I saw in my mirror every morning, I felt an undeniable connection I'd never fully acknowledged before. I need to talk to him, I said decisively. Before you do that, my mother replied, you should know something else. The will reading is scheduled for Friday. Richard has already spoken to Spencer about challenging any provisions that include you. Let him try, I said, anger replacing my initial shock. Grandma Marion wanted me there. She specifically told me she'd taken care of me in her will. My mother's expression changed. Marion was incredibly perceptive. I sometimes wondered if she figured everything out on her own. The next morning, I called Uncle Liam. After 32 years of cordial but distant birthday cards and occasional family event appearances, I was about to turn his world upside down. Olivia, he answered, surprise evident in his voice. This is unexpected. I'm so sorry about Marion. I'm flying in tomorrow for the will reading. We need to talk before that, I said. It's important. Can we meet when you arrive? Of course, he replied, concern in his voice. Is everything okay? No, I admitted. But it might be eventually. Uncle Liam and I met at a quiet cafe near the harbor. At 57, he looked remarkably youthful, with salt and pepper hair and weathered skin from years at sea. The resemblance between us was unmistakable now that I was looking for it. I told him everything, my father's revelation, my mother's confirmation, and the threat to my inheritance. His face paled as the truth sank in. I have a daughter, he whispered, tears forming in his eyes. All these years, I've missed everything. Did you ever suspect? I asked. He shook his head. The timing could have made it possible, but Catherine, your mother, was so certain when she told me she was marrying Richard. I respected her decision and tried to move on with my life. He paused, running a hand through his hair. This explains why Richard insisted I stay away. He always came up with reasons why my visits were inconvenient. We talked for hours, filling in 3 decades of missed connection. I learned about his research, his failed marriage, and how he'd never had other children. We need proof, he finally said. If Richard is challenging the will based on biology, we should have DNA confirmation. We found a lab that offered expedited testing with results available in 48 hours, just in time for the will reading. The process was simple, cheek swabs and forms confirming our consent. While waiting for the results, I tried to learn more about Grandma Marion's will. Her personal attorney, Victoria, was separate from Spencer, my father's friend and the family lawyer. I can't discuss specific provisions, Victoria told me when I visited her office, but I can tell you that your grandmother was very deliberate about her estate planning. She revised her will extensively last year. Did she know? I asked directly. About my biological father? Victoria's professional demeanor slipped momentarily. Your grandmother was an exceptionally perceptive woman. Very little escaped her notice. That non-answer told me everything I needed to know. Grandma Marion had suspected or discovered the truth. My confidence was short-lived. That evening, I received a formal letter from Spencer's firm. He had petitioned the court to delay the will reading pending resolution of identity concerns regarding purported beneficiaries. My father was moving faster than anticipated, using his connections to buy time. When I called Victoria to ask about the delay, her secretary informed me she had been suddenly hospitalized with pneumonia and would be unavailable indefinitely. It seemed too convenient to be coincidence. Uncle Liam called that night with news that made my blood run cold. I've been speaking with an old family friend, a nurse who worked with our parents decades ago, he said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. Olivia, Richard isn't biologically a Sullivan. What? I gasped. Our parents adopted him as an infant after our mother had several miscarriages. When she unexpectedly became pregnant with me years later, they decided to keep the adoption quiet, not wanting Richard to feel like less than their son. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If Richard wasn't a blood Sullivan, then by his own logic. Does he know? I managed. I don't think so. Our parents took this secret to their graves. But Marion might have known. She and our mother were extremely close. That explained why Spencer seemed so confident despite our pending DNA test. There must be something in the will or trust document specifically addressing bloodlines. The DNA results arrived via encrypted email 24 hours before the rescheduled will reading. With trembling fingers, I opened the document, scanning for the conclusion buried amid scientific terminology. Probability of paternity, 99.99998%. Uncle Liam was unquestionably my biological father. I called him immediately, and we agreed to meet before the will reading to discuss our approach. Armed with DNA proof, I finally had leverage against my father, or so I thought. That evening, Spencer requested an urgent meeting at his downtown office. Despite my misgivings, I agreed, curious about this sudden outreach from my father's ally. The elegant offices of Caldwell and Associates signaled old money and discretion. Spencer, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, greeted me with practiced cordiality that didn't reach his eyes. I believe we should discuss certain developments before tomorrow's reading, he said smoothly. You mean the fact that Richard isn't my biological father? Or that you filed a frivolous petition to delay the reading? I countered. His smile tightened. Actually, I was referring to the DNA test you and Liam arranged. My blood ran cold. How could he possibly know about the test? We had been meticulously careful. Richard was quite distressed to learn of this independent investigation, Spencer continued. He asked me to convey a proposal. He slid a document across his desk, a waiver agreement relinquishing all claims to Marion Sullivan's estate in exchange for a one-time payment of $500,000. This is absurd, I said, pushing it back. Grandma specifically included me in her will. Yes, under the presumption you were Richard's daughter. Now that we know otherwise, now we know I'm Liam's daughter, which makes me even more legitimately Marion's granddaughter. I interrupted. Blood relatives deserve the family fortune. Isn't that what Richard always says? Spencer's expression shifted. There are complexities you're unaware of regarding the Sullivan Trust that supersede simple biology. What complexities? I'm not at liberty to discuss details before the reading, but I strongly advise you to consider this offer. Richard is prepared to be quite aggressive in defending the family interests. The veiled threat hung between us. I left without signing, more determined than ever to stand my ground, but deeply unsettled by Spencer's confidence despite our seemingly ironclad DNA evidence. The morning of the will reading dawned crisp and clear, Boston's autumn painting the trees in brilliant hues outside Grandma Marion's Beacon Hill home. I arrived early with Uncle Liam, our shared secret a fragile weapon we weren't yet certain how to deploy. The family gathered in the formal dining room, with its hand-painted wallpaper and antique chandelier that had witnessed generations of Sullivan family dramas. Spencer presided from the head of the table, leather portfolio open before him, while various relatives filled the high-backed chairs. My father sat directly opposite me, his posture radiating confidence, flanked by my two cousins who looked uncomfortable but determined to support their father. My mother had chosen a seat near the door, as if preparing for a quick escape if needed. Before we begin, Spencer announced, I must address a delicate matter regarding succession eligibility. My father straightened, shooting me a triumphant glance. It has come to our attention that certain beneficiaries named in Marion Sullivan's will may not qualify under the bloodline provisions of the original Sullivan family trust. My mother gripped my hand beneath the table. Spencer continued, as you know, Marion's estate is divided between assets she controlled independently and those governed by the family trust established by her father. The trust specifically requires beneficiaries to be blood descendants of the Sullivan line, which is precisely why we need to address Olivia's situation, my father interrupted smoothly. Recent information suggests she is not my biological daughter and therefore has no claim to the Sullivan inheritance. A ripple of murmurs circulated around the table. Uncle Liam and I exchanged glances as our carefully rehearsed plan was derailed by my father's preemptive strike. I have DNA evidence, my father continued, sliding a folder toward Spencer, confirming Olivia is not my biological child. Under the bloodline requirement, she is ineligible for trust distribution. My heart pounded as Spencer reviewed the documents. We had anticipated raising the paternity issue ourselves, but my father had outmaneuvered us by presenting his own testing I had never consented to or provided samples for. May I ask how you obtained my DNA for this test? I asked, fighting to keep my voice level. My father's smile was cold. From your water glass at our last family dinner. Quite simple, really. That's illegal, Uncle Liam interjected. Unauthorized DNA testing, irrelevant to the inheritance question, Spencer cut in. The science is sound regardless of collection methods. I felt our carefully constructed plan crumbling. If Spencer accepted my father's evidence while dismissing the legality of collection, we would lose our chance to reveal the truth on our terms. I have additional evidence pertinent to the bloodline question, I said firmly, removing our own testing results from my bag. DNA confirmation that Liam Sullivan is my biological father. The room erupted in shocked exclamations. My father's face contorted with fury as he turned on my mother, who met his gaze unflinchingly. This changes nothing, Spencer insisted after reviewing our documentation. The trust specifies Sullivan blood from Marion's direct line, which flows through her son Richard to his legitimate heirs. It was the opening we needed. Uncle Liam stood slowly, commanding the room's attention. I believe we need to examine the precise language of the trust, he said. My understanding is that it requires beneficiaries to be blood descendants of Harold Sullivan, Marion's father. If that's the case, we have a significant problem. Spencer frowned. What problem? Richard is not biologically a Sullivan, Uncle Liam stated clearly. He was adopted as an infant, a fact our parents kept private to protect him, but which Marion was aware of. The silence that followed was deafening. My father's face drained of color as he stared at his brother in naked shock. That's absurd, he finally sputtered. A desperate lie. I have the adoption records, Uncle Liam continued implacably, producing another folder. And DNA confirmation. If we're applying a strict bloodline test as Richard insists, then I am Marion's only biological child, and Olivia, as my biological daughter, is her only blood grandchild. Spencer looked stricken as he examined the documents, his loyalty to my father visibly warring with his professional obligations. This is outrageous, my father shouted, rising from his chair. I won't stand for this slander. You're the one who insisted only blood relatives deserve the Sullivan fortune, I reminded him quietly. Are you retracting that position now? Before my father could respond, the dining room doors opened to reveal Victoria, Grandma Marion's personal attorney, still pale from her illness, but determined. I apologize for my tardiness, she said, nodding to me. I believe my presence is required for this reading. Spencer's dismay confirmed our suspicion. Victoria's unexpected recovery threatened whatever legal maneuvering my father had orchestrated in her absence. I would like to review the documents before proceeding, Victoria insisted, her experienced gaze already noting the tension filling the room. As Victoria settled at the table with the various test results and adoption papers spread before her, my father looked truly afraid for the first time. Whatever scheme he had constructed with Spencer was rapidly unraveling. Victoria adjusted her reading glasses as she reviewed the final pages of Grandmother's will, her voice steady and authoritative. Before addressing specific bequests, I must draw attention to a letter Marion Sullivan instructed me to read if questions of lineage arose during this proceeding. She opened a sealed envelope bearing the Sullivan family crest embossed on heavy cream paper. The room fell silent as she began to read. To my family gathered here, if this letter is being read, then the secret I have kept for decades has finally surfaced. I have always known that Richard was not born of Sullivan blood, but was welcomed into our family through adoption, a noble act of love by my husband and myself after years of heartbreak. I have also known since the moment I first held her that Olivia is Liam's biological daughter. A grandmother knows her own blood. The Sullivan trust established by my father requires blood relation for principal inheritance. Having anticipated potential conflict, I have restructured my personal assets, which constitute the majority of what you now call the Sullivan fortune, to reflect my wishes rather than outdated notions of bloodline purity. To Richard, you have been my son in every way that matters, but your treatment of Olivia, your brother's child, has revealed a character that dishonors the Sullivan name you so jealously guard. By your own insistence on blood qualification, you have disqualified yourself from what you most covet. Victoria paused, looking directly at my father, whose face had gone ashen. In accordance with Marian's explicit instructions, Victoria continued, and in light of the DNA evidence presented today confirming both Richard's adoption and Olivia's parentage, the distribution is as follows. The trust assets requiring Sullivan bloodline pass to Liam Sullivan and his biological daughter, Olivia. Marian's personal estate will be distributed according to the specific bequests outlined here. My father lunged for the documents, but Victoria calmly shifted them away. You promised, my father shouted at me, desperation breaking through his composed facade. You said only blood relatives deserve the fortune. No, I corrected him quietly. You said that. I merely asked if you would keep your word about it, and you promised you would. The justice of this moment wasn't in the inheritance itself, but in watching my father's carefully constructed reality crumble under the weight of his own hypocrisy. The aftermath unfolded like the final act of a Greek tragedy. My father, undone by his own machinations, stormed from the mansion shouting threats of legal challenges that everyone present knew would fail. Spencer followed, his professional reputation in tatters after Victoria revealed his knowledge of the adoption records he had deliberately concealed. My cousins, stunned by the revelations, approached me uncertainly. We had no idea about any of this, my cousin Emma said quietly. All those years, the way he treated you, it makes a terrible kind of sense now. Her brother Michael nodded soberly. For what it's worth, you've always been our cousin. That hasn't changed. Their sincerity moved me more than I expected. They had been shaped by my father too, in different ways. Perhaps there were relationships worth salvaging there, given time. My mother approached next, relief and apprehension mingling in her expression. I should have told you years ago, she said. You were protecting me. I finished for her. I understand that now. The most profound conversation came later that evening when Uncle Liam and I sat in Grandma's study, surrounded by the books and artifacts of a family history we were both rewriting in our minds. What will you do now? He asked, the weight of missed years heavy in his voice. Build something new, I answered simply. We can't recover the time we lost, but perhaps we can create something better going forward. He smiled, the expression so similar to my own that I wondered how I hadn't seen the resemblance before. I'd like that very much. As we talked into the night, sharing stories and discovering connections, I felt Grandma Marian's presence in the room, her wisdom, her foresight, her absolute certainty that truth would eventually prevail. She had arranged everything perfectly, ensuring that justice would be served without requiring me to deliver it personally. In the end, my father's downfall came not from my actions, but from his own character, revealed under pressure. He had spent decades ensuring I felt like an outsider in the family, never suspecting that he was the true outsider all along. The irony was perfect and perfectly sufficient. And that's how our storyteller found justice, in one of the most ironic ways possible. The father who tried to use blood relation to deny her inheritance ended up disqualifying himself by the very same standard. Let's take a moment to reflect on what makes this story so powerful. First, there's the grandmother, Marian, who knew everything but chose to let the truth reveal itself naturally. Her foresight in arranging her will to account for all possibilities shows incredible wisdom and patience. Rather than creating drama during her lifetime, she ensured justice would prevail after she was gone. Then there's Richard, whose obsession with control and status led him to keep his adopted status secret while weaponizing his daughter's biological parentage against her. His hypocrisy is a stark reminder of how greed can warp someone's perspective and blind them to their own contradictions. And what about our storyteller? Despite being treated as an outsider her entire life, she maintained her dignity throughout the ordeal. She didn't seek revenge, she simply stood her ground and allowed the truth to emerge. In the end, she gained not just an inheritance, but something far more valuable, a relationship with her biological father and a chance to build authentic family connections based on love rather than obligation. This story teaches us several important lessons. First, the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. Second, those who build their arguments on shaky moral ground often find themselves victims of their own logic. And finally, sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's watching someone become entangled in their own web of lies. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this family drama. What would you have done in the storyteller's position? Would you have confronted your father earlier? Would you have tried to build a relationship with your biological father even without the inheritance situation? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of family secrets and karmic justice, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories every week. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support means the world to us, and it helps these amazing stories reach more people who might need to hear them. Until next time, remember, blood may define your genetics, but it's actions that truly define your family.